What if one of the greatest minds in Western psychology discovered that the very idea of a self is an illusion, not a metaphor, not a theory, but a direct lived realization passed down from a barefoot sage who sat beneath a tree and saw through reality itself? In 1939, as the world stood on the brink of war, another kind of reckoning was unfolding quietly, invisibly within the soul of Carl Jung. He had spent decades mapping the unconscious, decoding dreams, and helping others face the shadows within. But nothing prepared him for what he found next. A truth that came not from a lab or a textbook, but from a 500-year-old teaching of the Buddha. The I you cling to does not exist. For Jung, a man who built his life's work around the self, the core of consciousness, this wasn't just shocking, it was sacred. He called it the most sensible and most direct of all religions. How could the West's deepest search for identity meet the East's bold call to dissolve it? And more importantly, how could both lead to healing? This is the story of when Carl Jung met the Buddha, not in person but in spirit. And what emerged from that meeting wasn't contradiction. It was a mirror, a doorway, and maybe a path out of suffering. What did one of the greatest minds of Western psychology see in Buddhism? And how can two seemingly opposite views, Jung's self and Buddha's no self, both lead to healing, clarity, and truth? To understand the magnitude of this encounter, we need to travel back in time. First to a grove in ancient India, where a prince-turned-seeker sat beneath the Bodhi tree and awoke to the truth of impermanence. In that moment, Siddhartha saw that our sense of a fixed, unchanging self was a construct, a story we tell ourselves to avoid the discomfort of constant change. This insight, known as Anatta no self, would become a pillar of Buddhist philosophy. Not as a cold doctrine, but as a liberating truth, discovered through direct experience. Now fast forward to early 20th century Europe. In a room filled with smoke, books, and silence, Carl Jung, already a rising star in psychology, found himself drawn to Eastern thought. It began with the writings of Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher who spoke openly about suffering illusion and the limitations of reason. Jung later wrote, Schopenhauer was the first to speak of the suffering of the world of passion, evil, and confusion. He opened a new door. That door led Jung into a lifelong fascination with Eastern wisdom. In 1909, his friendship with Richard Wilhelm, a scholar and translator of ancient Chinese texts, deepened this passion. From then on, Jung spent his mornings poring over Sanskrit, amassing one of the most extensive private collections of Buddhist manuscripts in Europe. But this wasn't just academic curiosity. Jung began to see deep parallels between Buddhist teachings and the stories his patients shared in dreams, crises, and awakenings. Both traditions spoke of a deeper truth hiding beneath the ego. Both saw healing not as escape, but as integration. And here's the mystery, though: Jung and Buddha seemed to stand on opposite shores, one speaking of a self to be realized, the other of a self to be dissolved. Both offered paths to wholeness. And remarkably, both are supported by modern research into meditation, trauma recovery, and the nature of consciousness. So how can two truths so different both be right? The answer lies not in contradiction, but in complementarity. Jung's self points us inward to the deep work of reclaiming our fragmented psyche. Buddha's no-self points us beyond to the peace that comes when we stop clinging altogether. Together, they form a bridge between healing and transcendence. In a world obsessed with identity, performance, and constant striving, their message cuts through like lightning. You are more than your story, and less than your illusion. This isn't just philosophy. It's a path a practice, a way of seeing. So whether you're wrestling with anxiety chasing success or simply longing for peace, the wisdom of Jung and Buddha invites you to do one thing: look deeper, not just into your mind, but beyond it. Jung, he didn't just study Eastern wisdom. He lived it. His analytical psychology emerged during a time of profound global transformation and deep personal searching. While treating patients in his quiet Swiss practice, Jung began noticing patterns that felt uncannily familiar: visions, dreams, symbolic imagery that matched ancient Buddhist descriptions of the mind. In his clinical notes from 1925, he wrote of this strange convergence. It wasn't coincidence, he believed. It was the human soul whispering truths that transcended geography and time. Both Jung and the Buddha, though separated by centuries and culture, were asking the same timeless questions: what causes suffering? And who or what is the self that suffers? Their methods were different. Jung explored the unconscious through psychoanalysis, the Buddha through meditation, but both arrived at a strikingly similar insight: that our suffering is deeply rooted in a false sense of self. What's even more remarkable is how their personal crises mirrored one another. Buddha's enlightenment followed a period of deep ascetic struggle and spiritual questioning. Jung's own spiritual crisis, meticulously documented in his Red Book, was equally intense, a descent into the depths of his psyche, where he confronted inner archetypes and visions beyond rational understanding. Both men emerged from those ordeals transformed. Yet their worlds shaped the language they used. The Buddha spoke in the language of Dharma, dependent origination and emptiness. Jung expressed himself through the language of archetypes, symbols, and the collective unconscious. And while these vocabularies sound different on the surface, they often pointed to the same inner terrain. So what exactly did Jung mean when he spoke of the self? In his groundbreaking work Ion, published in 1951, Jung describes the self as something far more expansive than the ego. He writes the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. To Jung, the ego, our waking identity, is just the tip of a vast psychological iceberg. Beneath it lies a deep, mysterious reservoir he called the unconscious, filled not just with personal memories, but with universal patterns he termed archetypes. These archetypes, he discovered, were shared across cultures and time periods. In fact, many of his patients, without any knowledge of Eastern religions, began drawing mandalas. During therapy, intricate circular symbols Jung recognized from Buddhist and Hindu traditions as representations of the self. One case stood out. A businessman suffering from deep anxiety dreamed of a glowing crystal resting at the bottom of a dark, endless well. He'd never read Buddhist scriptures, but Jung, stunned, realized his patient had unknowingly tapped into the image of the diamond body, a powerful Buddhist symbol for the indestructible nature of awakening. For Jung, this wasn't metaphor, it was revelation. He came to see the self not as a static identity, but as a living, evolving process. In psychology and alchemy, he described it as the process of becoming whole, what he called individuation. This confrontation is the heart of what Jung called shadow work, facing the exiled parts of our being and reclaiming them. Finally, they approached the true self, a state of psychological and spiritual integration. To Jung, this final realization bore a striking resemblance to Buddhist enlightenment. He wasn't guessing. Jung backed his theories with decades of clinical observations, dream analysis, and cross-cultural research. In thousands of documented cases, he saw a recurring pattern, a radiant center emerging from within, often surrounded by chaos, darkness, or fragmentation, much like the mandalas of Tibetan Buddhism. In Jungian psychology, the self is both the origin and the destination. As he wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, this center is not only the goal of life, but also its source. It is a paradox containing both good and evil spirit and matter, the conscious and the unconscious. Late in his life, Jung began to explicitly bridge his ideas with Buddhist thought. In his foreword to D.T., Suzuki's writings on Zen, Jung acknowledged the radical nature of the Buddhist teaching of Anatta, or no self. He called it one of the most daring and disruptive propositions in the history of human thought. In the Anatta Sutta, the Buddha's second sermon after enlightenment, he challenged the deeply held belief in a permanent self. What we call self, he taught, is actually a stream of sensations, thoughts, emotions, none of which are lasting or independent. Modern Buddhist scholar Bhikkhu Bodhi writes, "The doctrine of Anatta is not merely a philosophical opinion, but a strategy, a skillful means for cutting through the illusion of self so that we can finally let go of clinging and find true peace." And this, astonishingly, is where Jung and Buddha meet. Not in theory, but in purpose. Both sought to liberate us from the prison of a false self. One used dreams, the other meditation. Both believed that true healing begins when we dare to look inward and let go. To fully grasp what Buddha meant by no self, we must understand the spiritual context in which his insight arose. In ancient India, the dominant Vedic tradition spoke of Atman, an eternal, unchanging soul believed to be the essence of who we are. But through years of meditation and direct experience, the Buddha realized something radically different. He didn't find a fixed soul at the center of human experience. Instead, he found movement, an endless flow of moment-to-moment awareness with no permanent anchor. To help others see this for themselves, the Buddha introduced a simple but powerful framework. The 5 skandhas, or aggregates, form feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These 5 components, he taught, make up what we call a person. But when examined closely, none of them, individually or collectively, can be identified as the self. To illustrate this, the Buddha often used the metaphor of a chariot. If you take a chariot apart, its wheels, axle reins, and frame, where does the chariot go? It was never a fixed thing, just a convenient label for parts working together. Likewise, our self is not a solid object, but a useful convention. A story told to organize experience. But under examination, it vanishes like mist. This idea is beautifully captured in an ancient Buddhist dialogue from the Milinda Panha, where the monk Nagasena tells a curious king, "Nagasena is only a name, a label. There is no permanent person here." The monk wasn't being evasive. He was demonstrating a deep truth. What we take to be a person is a process, not a fixed identity. Later texts, such as the Visuddhimagga, use the metaphor of a lamp flame appearing continuous yet changing in every moment. The flame you see now is not the same as the one before. Still, it gives light. Still, it functions. The illusion of continuity doesn't require a permanent core. Importantly, the Buddha never insisted there is no self. That would only replace one rigid view with another. Instead, he invited us to look. In the Samyutta Nikaya, he taught that the sense of self cannot be located because it isn't something we have. It's something we construct. This insight doesn't create despair. It offers freedom. The Dhammapada says, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Letting go of a fixed identity isn't loss. It's relief. It's the end of endlessly trying to protect something that doesn't exist. Throughout Buddhist traditions, this teaching appears again and again. Zen masters ask, What was your original face before your parents were born? Tibetan teachers guide students to ask, "Who is it that thinks?" These are not riddles, they are doorways, invitations to look beyond identity, beyond clinging, and into the open space of being. And the point is always the same: liberation. When we stop grasping for a permanent self, we stop fighting reality. We stop resisting change. What remains is a clear, compassionate awareness, free to meet each moment fully. And it's here, right here, that Jung and Buddha meet again. At first glance, their teachings seem to point in opposite directions. Jung speaks of discovering the self. The Buddha speaks of seeing through it. But look deeper, and something extraordinary emerges. In Jung's later writings, he begins to echo the paradox found in Buddhist thought. He describes the self as a unifying principle, something vast encompassing both consciousness and the unconscious. It is both the center and the whole circumference, he wrote. It is everything and nothing. Just like the Buddhist Sa. In his private notes from 1938, Jung reflected, "The experience of the self brings with it the dissolution of the identity we've always taken for granted." This is where the apparent contradiction disappears. Jung's self-realization and Buddha's liberation are not opposites, but reflections of the same movement beyond the ego. Both men saw that clinging to a fixed identity causes suffering. Jung taught that the ego is a necessary construct, but not the end of the story. The ego helps us navigate the world, yes. But real healing comes when we see through its illusions. Similarly, the Buddha acknowledged conventional identity as a tool, but warned against taking it as absolute. They both point to something deeper. Jung was especially fascinated by the Tibetan Book of the Dead. In it, he found vivid descriptions of the mind dissolving into clear light, a state of pure awareness. He recognized these descriptions in his patients' reports of ego death and in his own experiences during his psychological crisis. What Buddhism calls emptiness, he wrote, we might call the ultimate ground of psychic reality. In the Red Book, Jung recounts moments where his familiar sense of self evaporated. What remained was a luminous silence, a state he called the pleroma, free of all dualities, matter and spirit, good and evil, I and not I gone. Both Jung and Buddha agreed our typical sense of self is the source of suffering. Buddhism teaches that suffering comes from clinging to what cannot last. Jung found that psychological distress often comes from the ego's refusal to accept what the unconscious reveals, leading to anxiety, fragmentation, even despair. Yet both offer a way through. For the Buddha, it is the eightfold path: right view, right action, right mindfulness. For Jung, it is individuation, a deep process of shadow work, integrating the anima or animus, and ultimately encountering the self. Their methods differ, but their direction is the same: inward, then beyond. Jung's concept of archetypes also forms a bridge. These universal psychic patterns exist beyond any individual mind. In Buddhist terms, they are echoes of the Dharma, the patterns of reality that hold true whether we recognize them or not. Even their therapeutic practices overlap. Jung's active imagination, a technique for dialoguing with inner symbols, mirrors Buddhist visualization and mindfulness practices. Both aim to loosen the grip of the ego and let deeper wisdom emerge. As Jung once wrote after years of studying Eastern thought, "The East has taught me a more profound and higher understanding, an understanding through life itself. And at the heart of both teachings lies a shared conviction: you don't find truth by thinking your way there. You find it by experiencing it, by walking through fire, by sitting in silence, by facing the truth of who you are and who you're not." Too often, we fight against parts of ourselves we don't understand, fears, habits, emotions we've labeled as wrong or unworthy. But one psychiatrist observed something beautifully simple. When we stop fighting ourselves, integration happens naturally. And in that quiet surrender, something begins to heal. Jung's practice of active imagination, a dialogue with the living symbols inside us, takes on new depth when approached through the lens of Buddhist wisdom. Instead of trying to strengthen the ego or fix our personality, we begin to move more fluidly between the shifting aspects of our psyche. As one longtime meditator shared, "I used to believe I had to become someone better. Now I see there is no fixed self to improve, only a living process to trust." This realization is a lifeline for those wrestling with chronic identity struggles. Jung's roadmap of psychological development, when enriched by the Buddha's insight into impermanence, shows us that much of our suffering comes not from who we are, but from the rigid stories we cling to about who we should be. One case study told of a businessman whose life was ruled by workaholism. It wasn't therapy alone that changed him, but the merging of two truths. From Jung, he learned that his ambition wasn't inherently wrong. From the Buddha, he discovered it wasn't ultimately who he was. He began to see his drive not as a fixed identity, but as a pattern, one he could now relate to with more wisdom and choice. Even our relationships are transformed by this understanding. When we no longer chase a permanent self or deny our humanity altogether, we show up more fully for others. A couples therapist noted, "When both partners understand what Jung and Buddha are really saying, the arguments about who's right begin to fade. In their place, something deeper emerges, compassion for each other's essence, not just their ego. But this isn't just personal, it's cultural. In boardrooms and leadership retreats, this synthesis is bearing fruit. Programs that integrate Jungian insight with Buddhist presence are helping executives lead with clarity and humility." One CEO reflected, "Understanding the self as both center and no center made me more effective but also more humble. I no longer lead from control. I lead from connection." Today, therapists, coaches, and spiritual teachers continue finding fresh ways to weave these paths together. And what's clear is, the power isn't in choosing between Jung and Buddha, but in allowing both to shine light on the human journey. What once seemed like a contradiction, Jung's self and Buddha's no-self, now reveals itself as a sacred complement. Their wisdom, separated by continents and centuries, speaks in harmony about the deepest truths of human consciousness. Near the end of his life, Jung wrote, "The goal of Eastern religion and Western psychology is the same: to shift the center of gravity from the ego to the self." And the Buddha said, "Like a mirage, like a bubble, so should one regard the world. Not because life is meaningless, but because when we release our grip on identity, we meet life as it truly is, impermanent, luminous, alive." Our suffering doesn't come from having or not having a self. It comes from how we relate to the experience of being alive. And in this meeting point where identity softens and truth rises, Jung called it wholeness. The Buddha called it liberation. Both paths lead us to the same universal truth. Freedom lies beyond the illusion of separation. Like the two wings of a single bird, Jungian depth psychology and Buddhist wisdom lift us together, offering a way through confusion toward clarity, beyond ego into wholeness. So now, I leave you with a question, one that may stay with you long after this video ends. What lies beyond the story you tell yourself about who you are? Take a moment to reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments. What resonated with you? What challenged you? Your voice adds richness to this conversation. And if you haven't already, subscribe to join us on this journey. Together, we'll keep exploring the sacred questions that shape our inner and outer lives. Until next time, may your path be lit with clarity, guided by courage, and filled with compassion. See you in the next video.